It's June 2025 and I had the pleasure of meeting Adrian Horan at Drumbo Greyhound Stadium for a chat. Adrian is the son of Mick Horan, who was the first trainer of the iconic Mick the Miller, who won the English Greyhound Derby in 1929 and 1930. And Mick the Miller would have been 99 years old this month if he'd still have been living. And I just really wanted to thank Adrian for coming along just to tell me a wee bit about what he remembers. So Mick the Miller, he won 2 English derbies back to back.
My father, we trained him in the 29 year, and then I think he was sold and he went to Claire Orton, who trained at Wimbledon. I think the sad part about the Mick the Miller was Father Brophy sold the dog on the steps of White City, unknown to him. So I think that was
Unknown to your father?
Yeah,
right.
That was the sad part of the story.
Yeah. What age was your father when he trained, Mick?
So say he was born about 1898, so he would have been about 29 or 30 when Mick the Miller.
And how did he get entrusted with the dog to train it?
I think my father would have a good reputation as a trainer. It was just the start of greyhound racing. My father was recommended to train him, so that was the start of that story.
It's a story that Michael Tanner captured in his book about Mick the Miller, and I think it's fair to say he is widely regarded as one of the greatest racing greyhounds of all time. His achievements helped to define the sport almost a century ago, and he's still a source of inspiration for future generations. I think we're very fortunate to still have a direct link through Adrian to his father, who was one of the dedicated trainers behind Mick's success.
I think his sire was called Glorious Event. Yeah.
Lay.
Yeah.
Dam.
This is the dam, and Glorious Event was the sire. So he was a nice blue brindle type of, nice, but wasn't. I don't know exactly what weight he was. He struck me as a dog to be about 68 or 69 pound.
Your father sadly passed away when you were only 13. But you must have grown up with plenty of stories before that about Mick the Miller.
Yeah, my brother Michael said, what a pity he didn't live longer, because he could have told some stories, and quite good at telling stories. But you always hear this famous story. There was another little brother called Macoma, and it is said that he could beat Mick the Miller every time they were tried. And then actually Mick the Miller was even tried over hurls, and even in the book it mentions Father Brophy was very much against running them over hurdles, and but then also Mick the Miller, or not, Macoma had a tragic accident, and he never was the same afterwards. But I say that Macoma was a success at stud, whereas Mick the Miller wasn't.
Right.
So,
and what did your father say anything about? Which one of the 2 dogs were
no,
his best?
Not an awful lot, but the old story of what might have been, only for that, because he could beat Mick the Miller in trials. There's a photograph we have somewhere in the house of him and Macoma, an unusual name, Macoma.
Yeah.
don't know where that came from. But you always hear, oh sure, I have a dog at home, I could beat him 6 lengths. Well, that was what we did hear any time they were tried, that Macoma could beat Mick the Miller in trials, but unfortunately Macoma got hurt in Celtic Park.
So, just thinking back, did your dad ever say that he thought Mick the Miller was going to be super special?
I think he did say to Father Brophy, I think we'll have something here, something special. I think that is mentioned. He mentioned that, and he said that about him, that he did have that
X factor.
Yes. But it probably wasn't the fastest dog in the world, but I think he was the most intelligent. Mick the Miller seemed to idolise the crowd, where I always take that with a pinch of salt, but after winning or coming from the crowd, he seemed to love attention of the crowd. But one thing I did say about him, he was one of the most clever dogs I ever had seen racing. And even in the book, it tells you about how clever he was. If he saw a dog in front of him, he saw him lifting his head up and letting the other dog and slipping up the inside. He'd steal lengths and bends. But I think from what I read in the book, he was a better dog over a longer distance than over the 525. Also, just when I was looking across the TV the other day, he also won the Welsh Derby. One story I do remember, he was 6 year old. He was over in London, probably if I was selling dogs across to London afterwards, and he went to Wembley to see him win this at Leisure when he was 6 years of age. Now that's practically unheard of.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't just recall how many. He had something like so many consecutive wins.
19 consecutive
Yeah,
wins.
and back in the 70s, there was a bitch called West Park Mustard. Was out to try to break that record. West Park Mustard was trained by Tommy Johnson, and they had a match in Shelburne. It was about 1973. Tommy Astor and West Park Mustard. Tommy Astor was trained by Paddy Kane. Well, I think, if I'm right, I think Tommy Astor beat West Park Mustard in a match. But they were, I mean, it's hard to believe that's 50 years ago.
It is. Given his superstar status, in 2011 the Mick the Miller Commemoration Committee erected a monument to him in Killa in County Offaly, the village where he was born.
You probably know yourself about where I came from, a village called Killa in County Offaly. And you were telling me a friend of yours was involved in the sculpture of Mick the Miller.
Yes, Liz O'Kane, yes.
Yes.
I knew her from her childhood. We went to the same primary school.
Yes.
And her father had priceless border. Is that
yes,
right?
He won the Derby in 1949. And I met him once or twice. Very nice man. We had the Taoiseach with Kyan. He was there, and he unveiled the opening. He unveiled the statue. Brendan Barry did an awful lot of work. We had a few drinks in the pub afterwards.
I might have to cut that from the video. I'll check with Brendan if that's okay to include.
You could just across the road was the priest's house, and it's probably run down, but that's where Mick the Miller was born. He's just facing the way I'm sitting, and the house is just only 100 yards across the road. Wow, where the house is. And Michael Green was a lot to do with training pups for Father Brophy.
In Michael Tanner's book, there's a fantastic action photo of Mick Horan slipping Mick the Miller on a visit to a London park for the benefit of the English press.
That was his job, slipping the box. So he was a slipper on the track and on the field.
But what, they pulled the lever on
just,
the box as the hair, as the
it was hand released.
Right.
Even in the McKee hair times, they used to take the pin out as the hair would come round.
Did he ever share any of his tips with you?
He was a powerful man for taking dogs out over the fields. That was his pet love, I would say, and often I went with him. But he was a great man for walking.
Many people come round to your house in the evenings to talk about dogs, or?
Oh yeah, Sunday was a big day in our house. We had, when my father's trained dogs, we had people would call, to see their dogs and that. But how my father came north was that the McAlindons were directors in Shelburne, and then they obviously knew him, and then they started up. Well, I think Selleck was the first greyhound track in Ireland. That would have been 1927, and I think Shelburne followed closely afterwards. So then it's through the fame with Mick the Miller, then the Macallans, how would you put it, coaxed him to go north. So that would be the way it was done. Celtic and Dunmore were the two favourites.
Celtic and Dunmore.
Yeah. And then, of course, you had to have a real fast dog for Dunmore. And I got great kick out of having Suburban Gent. He was favoured to win the 1972 English Derby. And unfortunately was knocked out in the semi-final. He won the consolation final. And when he came back, he broke the track record in Dunmore.
Over what distance?
Over the 435. something like 23-39. As I say, Jack McAllister had all the good dogs in those days before Jack Mullen. And I remember Pat Matusky saying to me one time, I says, what was the best dog ever you saw? And he says, Wonder Valley. He won the 1964 Irish Derby. That was Jack Mullen's. And I never saw him running Wonder Valley, but there was a little brother called Lucky Wonder. I think he won the national sprint. And Wonder Valley was quite a good coursing dog too. And then Pat Dalton bought him. You've heard of Pat Dalton? And I think he was quite successful at stud in America. And then in later years, there was John Quinn's dog that won the national sprint, was a good dog. I'm Slippy. And he won the English Derby and the national sprint.
So from your time at Dunmore, have you any favourite dogs that may have stood out for any particular reason?
Matter of fact, my mother had a bitch then called Gangster Doll. She broke the track record at Dunmore and did 30-48. And I remember that stood for a long time known. But I always remember the handicaps in Dunmore, which you always got a dog that came from scratch marked. They would get up the win. One dog in particular I always remember called Arab Lad, and he was owned by Andy McGarry. Andy McGarry had a pub in Belfast, and he would practically be last at the top end Dunmore and get up the win.
I don't remember the handicap racing. That must have been in the earlier years.
Yeah, it was over 550. It was 550 always, and it was scratch from 0 to 9. Usually 9 or 10 was the front mark. But were very interesting.
I always loved the Sean P. Graham 700.
Yes.
Any favourite stars from them?
Well,
races?
I trained Reader's Choice.
Oh, did you?
Yeah. And he won the Dunmore 700, and he was owned by Ben McCauley. And he was bought from Limerick Sales for 400 quid. He was the best 400 quid buy I can remember. And although he went again McKenna in the next year, he was second runner-up to Bashful Man in the Derby final the following year. Reader's Choice could have ran over any distance.
Did it not win one of the Harold's Cross marathons?
He did, yeah, right. He did. He won the Corncahull, and I think he also won the Cesarewitz in Navan.
Wow.
But yeah, he was a better dog over a distance. But he didn't know the word defeat. There was one time I think in Navan he was practically knocked down and he got up to win. Practically bowled over and he got up to win. That's shows you how good a dog he was.
What was your routine when you?
But when you got up in the morning, you went to bed at night, you were taking dogs out. Brendan would have walked dogs in the morning.
Brendan's your brother.
And in the evening time I would have worked. But my Uncle Ned was always there. He was the mainstay, and my mother, of course. And there were we had about 30 dogs then, Well, mainly training dogs.
And where were you racing then?
We were really missing in Dunmore and Selleck, and then would have went to Dundalk and Duncannon. And then in the 70s, I went a lot to Lifford. I liked Lifford a lot. And Lifford was a very successful time in Lifford. I just seemed to have the dogs that suited it. You just wanted to go where you had the dog. And I always liked Lifford. Nice track. Yep.
And at your time here with the racing at Drumbo, any particular superstars that you remember over the years?
There was a dog I remember called Chart King. I think he ran the English Derby. Yeah, Chart, very, very, very good dog round Ballyskee. Outstanding dog round here.
Who trained him?
The Hewitts from Lurgan.
Hewitts from Lurgan.
Yeah, right. And then Ronnie McKeown had a good bitch here. I think it was Duffy's Kestrel.
Kestrel, right.
Yeah, because remember, Nigel in the centre of the track and he was jumping for joy. At one occasion, I looked across and saw Nigel couldn't believe that she was in front. It always stuck in my memory how delighted he was out in the middle of the track, and he couldn't believe it that this is going to happen,
Living the dream.
Yeah.
Most of the racing community in Northern Ireland will have known Adrian from his time at Dunmore Stadium, where he was the assistant racing manager for many years. I suppose whenever Dunmore closed, there was a lot of the old characters and old faces from Dunmore that maybe didn't come across this far to this part of the town.
Unfortunately, a lot of them didn't carry on, which is always sad. Well, of course, you always got there's a good hardcore locals that always came here, and they would have went, and they'd always said, "You remember the Dunmore days?" I says, "Indeed I do." Never to forget them. I remember one time in Dunmore, the lids went up prematurely, and the dogs were flying down the street, and the hare was following them. I would love to have seen that on camera, and that happened in Dunmore many years ago. It was so funny, but I was amazed when somebody told me about. They used to run taxis from Ballymena to Dunmore, 20 to 30 taxis to take people to Dunmore.
Wow.
Now, that's hard to believe, isn't it? You didn't think that would on
before your time? No, I didn't.
And in the Dunmore days, we were lucky to have a cafe.
Yeah, it was underneath the stand.
Underneath the stand, yeah. And Bunny used to run it. All she got called was Bunny.
Bunny.
Yeah.
Them were the days of Sam Young. Whenever I remember, he was the racing manager there at the track.
Yeah.
So you and Sam would have worked very closely
together.
Yeah,
got on well with Sam. Yeah. And Jim Delargy was one of the directors, and Jim was the driving force behind Dunmore after 1977 when they took over. Remember Hughie, who was the groundsman at Dunmore? He said he was a very fast dog, ran in Dunmore, called Paul's Fun. I know that the dog that won the national sprint was Sandown champion in 1950, and he was a very famous stud dog after that. And my father kennelled him.
Right.
He was owned by a man called Jimmy Killeen, who was from Moy Valley in County Kildare, and he won the Derby in Clonmel, and he won the national sprint, 1950. So there you are. He ran away with the national sprint. So every heat he won by 6 lengths. People who invented the McKee hare were called McKees, and they owned Dunmore. They were into engineering, and they had all the contract for the McKee hare operated in England. There were numerous tracks then. Don't imagine. I mean, at one stage there was about 30 tracks in London, and it stood the test of time.
Mm-hmm. So we're very lucky to have this great facility here at Drumbo. What sort of dogs does it suit mostly?
Well, obviously, if you have a good trapper and a good railer, that's a big help. And whereas in Dunmore, with the long straight, you could get left and hit the bend in front. The dogs that ran well in Celtic ran well in White City, which was where the Derby was held. And I remember a dog called Sandstar who won the English Derby. It was 1969, owned by Hammy Orr. Hammy Orr lived then in Newton Ards, and he didn't really stay a 525 in Celtic, but White City suited him because a dog in those days, a dog that was getting 525 in Celtic would run well in White City. It's a nice track, White City, and that's where Mick the Miller won his derbies. It was a lovely track. It was. My father died when he was early 60s, which was a big loss to our family. He died on the train. Took a heart attack on the train going to Dublin, and it was on a Sunday. And unfortunately, I took the phone call. From the police from Helens Bay rang, and that who's in the house? Where Mick the Miller won his derbies. It was a lovely track. It was. My father died when he was early 60s, which was a big loss to our family. He died on the train. Took a heart attack on the train going to Dublin, and it was on a Sunday. And unfortunately, I took the phone call. from the police from Helens Bay rang and said, "Who's in the house?" I said, "My mother and uncle." Was that strange? Let me get it, So he died, took a heart attack on the train.
Age 60.
He's 60, say roughly 62.
And he'd been in good health prior to that.
I just remember now, when you think about it, we were walking dogs one day up the road, the Ballygranny Road, and he stopped and he went like a serious, he says, "I'm going to die." So he must have had probably would cause some form of heart trouble. In those days, there wasn't a treatment, but he probably was getting a touch of chest pain. And that was one thing that stuck in my memory. He says, "You just did this here." Mm-hmm. And then my mother took the phone call.
Life changed.
That was January, and life did change.
What year was that?
1962, I think it was. 62. And he's a nice man, my father. Very well liked.
What was his other hobbies other than the greyhounds?
Well, he loved hurling and Gaelic, loved it, and he loved the horses too. Of course, I should have included my Uncle Bill. My Uncle Bill was a jockey, and back in the 20s, he rode an Irish Grand National winner.
Really?
Yeah, it was a photo finish, but he, well, he was not, I don't know with modern technology, but he was declared the winner. He got the verdict.
That's the main thing.
I think he was an outsider. I think it was a 20-1 shot or more. And my Uncle Bill, he was friendly with Aubrey Brabazon, who was later to become Vincent O'Brien's top jockey. My Uncle Bill was involved with a dog called Guileless Joe. He won the first Irish Derby, Greyhound Derby, and my father and my uncle were operating them together. And it was only until recent times, till Mabel Bear told me, that Guileless Joe was owned by Jack Moylan. And Jack Moylan was Pat Edry's grandfather. My father he loved horses, and my Uncle Bill, who was a jockey, loved the dogs better. So it was a strange combination, but they worked together a lot, My mother, I asked my Uncle Ned, "What was the best dog ever you had?" That was my uncle. He says, "Guileless Joe." My mother quipped in, she says, "He's talking through his pocket." I said, "What do you mean?" "That's the dog that won the most money on." Well, if you won a derby, well, it wasn't really recognised as a derby then in those days, but I think it was in Hards Cross. But then I think they brought him to Dunmore, and he did a fantastic run round Dunmore. A time then, I think he broke the track record in Dunmore in the way before Mushery Shaggy came along. Well, that was 1932 that Guileless Joe was on the go. So my father and Uncle Bill and Ned were all on the crest of a wave then in the early 30s, So
yeah. Oh well, that made up for
it didn't last. It didn't last like everything else. It didn't last till Jack McAllister came along and Jack Mullen and Bren Matthews. After that, all the big names. But two of his sons and I are still operating. Young Aidan McAllister.
Oh yes.
Yeah, that's Jack's son.
Yeah. Oh right.
Yeah. Well, Jack McAllister had all the good dogs one time, and then shortly in around the same time as Jack Mullen.
Yes. So what's next for you, Adrian? What's the next steps? Would you still be looking for another Mick the Miller?
Unfortunately, none of my relations have any interest really in dogs at the minute.
On a personal note, it really has been a pleasure to have had this time with Adrian. He has a wealth of knowledge about greyhound racing, as we can all see throughout the decades. And the next chapter to his story that started with his dad training Mick the Miller, it's still to be written.